Something I've discovered when thinking about preaching is that how often themes from the Sabbath school lessons that can't actually turn up in what I'm thinking before I even look at the Sabbath school pamphlet. I was really impressed with last quarter's Sabbath school lessons because I think they made us look out of the church at what needs to be done out there. And I must confess I'm a little bit disappointed with the Psalms in that we're looking in again. But I do think that if we're going to talk to people outside of the church, we need to be very sure about our relationship with God. No, there's no use being diffident about what we're thinking about. But what occurred to me with this is, what was God's intention for creating the nation of Israel back when he did? And this is interactive, so you can talk to me. What was God's intention?
They would be a nation that would draw other nations to God.
Okay, and the thing about this is that I read a text in the Bible, and I've tried very hard over the last while to find it, that says that for the nation of Israel, when people come and ask you why your nation is like it is, you can tell them that we have a God that gave us good laws and statutes and judgments, and which we were talking about in the Sabbath school lesson this morning. So Israel's purpose was not just to be in a relationship with God that went nowhere. It actually had an outcome that God desired, and that was to be a witness to all the other nations around them. People who come new to the Bible probably shouldn't read Exodus and those books because there's all the destruction of people in there. But you've got to get the context of what was going on there to actually understand that. So, being put there, God said to them, I didn't choose you because you were the best. I didn't choose you because you were the most. I didn't choose you because you were the smartest. I didn't choose you for any of the reasons that you might think from a human standpoint. I chose you because I want to make of you what I want to make of you. True? And I think the echo for that is for us as individuals is that it doesn't matter where we come from. God has something that he will make of us if we're prepared to hand ourselves over. Would you agree with that? Now, God will make of us whatever's necessary. I was thinking at one time talking about the story of Esther, and there's a very interesting line in Esther where Mordecai says to her, who knows that you are brought to the kingdom for such a time as this? And the people of Israel who stayed in the Persian kingdom, I think in a lot of ways became pretty much indistinguishable from the people that were around them. You know, nobody knew when Esther went into the palace of Artaxerxes that she was a Jew. She was, to all intents and purposes, just a beautiful young woman from one of the 127 provinces of the empire. But when the crunch came, Mordecai reminded her of her background and what she needed to do. And I would like to suggest to you today that you might think your life's boring and it's going nowhere, but there will come an occasion where you need to stand up. You're brought to the situation for the time. Okay. So, being God's people was accompanied by requirements. Was it not? God gave them the Ten Commandments, and I was reading in Patriarchs and Prophets this morning before I came, that the Ten Commandments were pretty confronting for people who'd just come out of slavery. They really didn't have a lot of handles to get onto that. So Moses was actually given an expansion of the law, and they were not to receive the law until it actually gave them an expansion, and it covered so many things. You know, I read with interest one day that in those days when you built a house, for instance, and it had an upper story, you were required to put a parapet, a fence around the top. Why? Because your responsibility was to make sure that your neighbour didn't fall off if you came to visit. And it was all that sort of practical stuff that God expanded out of the law for them. And it was supposed to make them into an exemplary people. But, we had a Samoan pastor for a while and always used to say to us, we needed to be questionable people. And a lot of us English speakers think that when you say something's questionable, it's not a good thing. But what he meant was when people ask you the question, you'll be able to give the answer. We are questionable in that sense that we should be able to give an answer when it's required. He reminded them that they were not chosen, as I've just said, for any inherent advantages they had as people. They were chosen because he wanted to do with them what he wanted to do. When outsiders were to ask, I've already said, they would say their prosperity, their behaviour stemmed from the fact that they were given good laws. In spite of this, you can read the history of the people of Israel in the Old Testament, and they never ever really fulfilled God's mission. No, they never ever did. It's like I've always thought like a spider on caffeine. Up and down, up and down, up and down. There were moments, and men and women included, who drew Israel into the role that they were supposed to be performing, but it didn't stay. It didn't stick, and it was in the end really not that productive. And for them, it actually came to the point where God sent them off into captivity under the Babylonians. And the one thing that they learned under the Babylonians and the Persians was that God was serious about the fact that they were to keep away from the idolaters. And they did. And from 457 BC, when the commandment went forth, the next 50 years or so re-establishing Jerusalem, between that time and the coming of Jesus, there was no prophet. There was a time that they had to sort themselves out. And you have to think to yourself, had they sorted themselves out by the time Jesus came? Do you think they had? Well, in some respects they had, because they were so conscious of not being involved in idolatry that they adopted a position of superiority and isolation. Now, the easiest way for them not to be infected by the idolaters was to keep right away from them. Absolutely. The temple in Jerusalem eventually had a sign on it that if you were a foreigner, you entered the men's part of the temple on pain of death. I reckon that's a great message to put outside the church. Don't you think so? I was in Germany a few years ago, and we stopped on the way home from the Nürburgring in a town in the Ahr Valley. And one of the ladies said to me, come up to the church. There's a Catholic church in this town, a Catholic area. And on the door of the church there was a sign that says, Besucher nicht willkommen. Visitors not welcome. And I was a bit intrigued by that. Would we put a sign like that on the outside of our church? And it was really sad to go in and see what was happening. There were, 3 nuns who looked like they were about 95, and a couple of really old men there, and they were having evensong to a scratchy old tape recorder with a tape on it. It was really, and I could understand why they didn't want people to see that. And they told us that one of the real difficulties in that place was getting priests or lay brothers to actually run the services for them. That was a really sad indictment, but I've never forgotten the Besucher nicht willkommen on the door. So, Jesus had to contend with a lot of things when he started his ministry. Can you suggest to me what you think some of those might be?
Well, I think the people had probably added to the law.
Yeah. Pardon?
You believe that they're better?
Yes. All right. The superiority thing. Now, I should have asked you this when I started. Was I want you to think for a minute about the number of hints that Jesus gave to the disciples and the community about who he was prepared to deal with. Right, let's start with the Jewish community. What did he have to contend with there? The superiority. How did that work? How did that happen?
They'd become so paranoid about breaking the Ten Commandments that they created, what was it, 600?
Yeah, 600 and something.
Something different laws to all prevent them from reaching the point that they might break the original 10, and they were so fixated on another 600 that they forgot what the 10 actually were.
Okay, and they also felt that adherence to all of those laws guaranteed them salvation. Now, ergo, the rich young ruler came and said to Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Right? If I had asked you how do you get salvation, what would you tell me? First, foremost and always, we're dependent on the blood of Jesus Christ for salvation. It's got nothing to do per se with what we do. Now, whether we do good or bad things after that is about our response to what's given to us. It's not about those things causing our salvation. Because in that conversation, Jesus said to him, you know the law, do this, do that, do that. And he said, well, I've done all those things from my youth up. And he was looking for that one extra thing. What was his problem? He had stuff. And he didn't want to give up the stuff. It says he went away sorrowing because the one thing that Jesus told him he ought to do, he just felt he physically could not do. Okay? March down the street on the way to the temple and pray loudly, thank God that I'm not as other men are. I'm neither a Gentile, a woman, or an ass. Great prayer. Don't take notes on that one. Don't want to hear it at all. That attitude, right? Jesus remarking on the woman who came into the temple and put her sole amount of money into the temple and remarked that she'd given more than the person who blown the trumpet so that everybody could see the offering that they were bringing to the church. Yeah? When he did things in the community, he had to confront those laws that you were talking about. Can you think of any of those occasions?
Healing on the Sabbath. Healing on the Sabbath.
Well, healing. Well, healing I thought wasn't so bad, but healing on the Sabbath was a problem. He found the man on his bed and he said to him, rise up, take up your bed and walk. It was the Sabbath. And the Pharisees said to this man, who told you you could carry your bed today? Because there was a rule about what you could carry and how far you could carry it and all that sort of stuff. And it wasn't the done thing. Right? And he said, I really don't know who it was. He just told me to take up my bed and walk. And Jesus said to the Pharisees on occasions, if your ox or your ass fell into a ditch on Sabbath, you'd make every effort to get it out. And you're complaining because I'm dealing with a son and daughter of Abraham, dealing with the situation. And I was thinking this morning, Connor, dealing with children, is that across the spectrum he dealt with people's children. In the community, people might have regarded children as, I dare use the word disposable, you can always get another one. But he dealt with those people. Yeah? On the other hand, we had to deal with people who obviously found the whole business of keeping all those horrible laws a problem, so they just did whatever they did. And he dealt with people whose lifestyle had got them into illness and disease. Can you think of those? I've always been fascinated by the story in Luke where he healed 10 lepers. You know, and the throwaway line at the end of that in Luke is that only one came back to thank Jesus, and he was a Samaritan. Yeah? No, Jesus didn't look at the 10 lepers and say, all the Samaritans stand over there and all the Jews stand over there. You Jews are fine, off you go. It made no difference for them because they're all afflicted with the same thing. Yeah? True. He dealt with prostitutes. Yeah? I'll remind you from the last time I was here that there was a feast in Simon the leper's house. Right? Simon was a Pharisee and he was throwing a feast for Jesus. Now, if he hadn't been healed of his leprosy, there's no way in the world he'd be able to have a feast, because leper was barred from all social interactions of any kind. Yeah? Who was there at that feast?
Prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
Prostitute.
Well, she was, had been. What happened at that feast?
Mary washed his feet.
Speak up, don't mumble. I'm hard of hearing.
The woman washed Jesus' feet
With
perfume.
the perfumed oil, which was probably the whole of her life savings, including the jar, which would have been a very expensive piece, an alabaster jar full of this oil. And she did that. What was the reaction of people at that feast?
That's a waste of money.
Well, you read the account of the comment about the waste of money in 3 of the Gospels, and only one of them tells you who made the comment, and that was Judas. And it also has a throwaway line that Judas couldn't have cared less about the poor, but he held the money back to the disciples, and he was a thief. He was more concerned about money going into the bag that he had control over. So that's one thing. What else?
Shock and disapproval at a woman being in the room and touching the male.
Yes, and particularly if in his mind thinking if he knew what sort of a woman she was. Right. You know, we'll think about that for a minute. I think there's some enlightening information from one of our writers that Simon himself had been a customer of the woman, so it was a bit hypocritical for him to be sitting there, having been forgiven or having been healed of his leprosy, and to be thinking that about the woman. So here's that attitude on the behalf of the Pharisees coming through again, where he's prepared to look down on this woman because of her activity in her past, not the present going forward. Right? How did Jesus deal with that? Very tactfully, right? He was extremely tactful, because how did he go about it? He said, Simon, I've got something I need to say to you. And he told him a little story about 2 debtors. And Simon had to respond in the end that the person who'd been forgiven the most loved the most. And then he understood what Jesus was saying about the woman who was washing or oiling his feet and his head. So, you know, we see Jesus here confronting several issues: the attitude of the Pharisee, the past of Mary Magdalene, and the other one was that who else was at the feast? Lazarus. And a lot of people had actually come along what we call today to rubberneck. They wanted to see the man who'd been raised from the dead. And there would have been Pharisees somewhere in that who were plotting how to get rid of both Jesus and Lazarus, because Lazarus was living, walking proof of Jesus' claim to be able to do the things that he actually said he could do. Would you agree? All right, so there's a lot of hints. As I said last time, I had this feeling that the disciples rolled their eyes occasionally because Jesus said to them, we need to go back on the way, and on the way we'll go through Samaria. And they go, we need to go through Samaria. Why do we need to go through Samaria? Because the Jews hated Samaritans like poison, in spite of the fact that they were actually ethnically related. Do you realise that? When the Babylonians shifted people out, they shifted some out and some in, some out, and they mixed up and whatever. And if you recall the discussion with the woman at the well, you will find that there was a bit of attempted discussion about where to worship, how to worship, all those sorts of things, which Jesus actually cut short. Right. So Jesus dealt with the Samaritan, and as I said when I preached this in another place, if you're looking for your primary mission person to the community, would you pick a woman who had 5 husbands and was living with a de facto? I can't imagine us sitting in a church board trying to work out who we should have as a representative of the church and think, oh, there's that lady, she's been married 5 times. There's nothing in there that tells what she did with the husbands. I've always been curious about that. And, can you imagine that? And yet she was gratified by the fact that Jesus took her seriously as a person. He said, yes, this is your situation, but I'm offering you the water of life, which must have been interesting. How insulting for the disciples to be sent off into the Samaritan city where they didn't really want to go to get food for Jesus. When they came back and said, well, I've had such a great experience with this woman, I'm not hungry. Think about the practical issues here. And later on, as I've said before, the groundwork in Samaria had been done to the point where Philip went down there as a missionary to Samaria. Okay, so the question then is, in Jesus confronting all of that, why did he not tell them up front that the Great Commission was coming? Now repeat the Great Commission for me.
Go therefore and baptize.
Go ye therefore.
Baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things that I command you.
Yeah.
And I am with you always.
All right.
The full thing is, all power is given unto me, in heaven and earth.
Yes, and that's what we don't quote often, is that text that says all power is given to me in heaven and earth. And when you see it therefore, you need to refer back to what came before. Sometimes I think when we're talking about our acceptance of the Great Commission, we think how hard it is, because we don't take into account the fact that Jesus said, I will give you every assistance. Yes? No? I will give you every assistance. When I go away, I'm going to send another comforter. When he's come, he'll do this, and this. Will he not? Yeah. So, seeking the lost then. As I said in Sabbath school this morning, I was thinking about this the other day and thinking, when God decided that the sin of the earth was so great that he wished he'd never created it and he wanted to start again, all we got was Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and 3 wives, and every one of us on the planet today is descended from those 8 people. Ever thought about that? God kept his promise of saving the brilliant creation that he had actually made with people. Sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice by trying to be too humble about our relationship with God. If I said to you today, does God need us? What would you say? A lot of people say, oh no, he could manage without me. Does he need us? Why does he need us? He needs us, one, for the very same reason he put Israel in place. How many of us think about our passive witness? I'm not talking about when you decide that you're going to go and do something. I'm talking about just being you, day in and day out, amongst your family, your friends, your neighbours, whatever. That's you. Is there a passive witness in that? Yeah, to some extent, the witness that Israel was to give in a lot of respects was largely passive. The targets would come to them and see what they had and question why it was, and they go away having been given the appropriate answer. We don't have that luxury today, do we? Now, if Adventists live in enclaves, which some of them tend to, it's almost like as though we have a castle, and we make sure the moat's well dug, full of water, the drawbridge is pulled up and the portcullis is down. Seriously. And we'll very occasionally drop the drawbridge and raise the portcullis, and we'll make a foray out into the community with something, and then scuttle back in and pull the drawbridge up and drop the portcullis again. Why? Because we've adopted, I'm sorry if I sound harsh, it's Pharisaical. We don't want to associate with people out there in case they infect us with their sinfulness, because we have access to much better things, and it's much better for us if we don't get infected. Yeah? True or not? We might not want to confront that thought, but I think it's a very valid one. Yeah? Do we make decisions about with whom we will associate? Whether it's social, whether it's ethnic, whether it's anything that you can think of. Right. I want to ask you now, did Jesus give some hints about what it actually meant to take the gospel of every nation, kindred, tongue and people? I've already given you some. I want to see if you can think of some others.
His hints is really just in his ministry himself.
Yeah.
So he interacted with all kinds of people, Roman centurions.
Yeah. Now what I want to know is what kind of people? Who?
Sinners.
Who?
The people who were seeking him.
If we're honest, people came to Jesus with a problem. And it wasn't necessarily in their minds a spiritual problem, it was a physical or social problem. You think about that? The woman who touched his garment as he went by, she'd had an issue of blood for 38 years or something like that, which would have been terrible. It would have destroyed her capacity to socialise with the family, with the friends, with the community. She wanted to deal with that. And Jesus honoured that. Now, the lepers who came for healing wanted to be healed of their leprosy. They didn't see any great spiritual need. It was Jesus who often tacked onto his activity a comment relating to spirituality. Yeah? Or no? No? Your sins have been forgiven. Go and sin no more. He added that, not them. Okay, so he dealt with all sorts of people. Who else?
Outsiders.
Well, one time he went down to the Philistine coast and he was accosted by what's politely called a Syrophoenician woman in there, and she wanted her son or daughter, I can't remember now, healed. And the disciples wanted to shoo her away. And if you recall the conversation that Jesus gave to that woman was a vocal lesson to his disciples. It's not fit that you dine at the table. I like the woman's comeback. Now, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs from the table. Her faith was strong enough, in spite of the fact that she had, in everybody's eyes, no rights to ask for anything. And yet Jesus honoured her request. Right? Who else? Let's go back to the Jews for a minute. Jairus. What about Jairus? Who was he? He was an official of the temple. Now, the enemy, basically, as far as Jesus might have concerned, what was his need? His daughter. Yeah? And it's actually, if you read the stories, while he's on the way to Jairus' house, that the other incident occurred where Jesus stopped and said, "Who touched me?" Because I can see the power's gone out of me. And I can imagine Jairus there shifting from foot to foot, thinking, you know, my daughter is much more important. Who else? The centurion who came and said to him, "Lord, my servant is ill, very favoured, like him healed." Right? In the eyes of the Jewish population, would a centurion have had any right to be asking anything of Jesus? Somebody put it to me once that possibly the centurion, the Roman troops who were in Judea, Galilee, could possibly have been drawn from the Samaritans. Because the Romans had a policy that they put people together like that who didn't get along, because it stopped a lot of fuss. But apparently this centurion had made a great change in his life. So, you know, Jesus dealt with him on the basis that he was a human being with a human need. Yeah? There's another time where another centurion was recommended to Jesus because he built him a synagogue. Yeah? And we could go on and on with those things. So Jesus gave a lot of hints that he didn't really care where people came from, what their social status was, what their ethnic background was, anything. Couldn't care less. But he was concerned to save those people. Now, what was my last sermon about?
Belonging. Belonging.
What was my last sermon about? We have three words: belong, believe, behave. Which order should we have it? And the question I asked you was, over the people that we discussed last time, some of whom I've brought up again, is that at the end of the day, did they feel like they belonged to Jesus? They did, right? What they did about their belief and behaviour, we actually don't know. Right? But the important thing was that they needed to belong to Jesus. Now, I want to tell you another uncomfortable thing is the Gospel Commission does not say, "Go you therefore and get yourself to heaven." But unfortunately, I behave like it at times, and I'm sure that there's people who behave like our consciousness is centred around whether we're good enough to get to heaven or not. And effectively, we ask the same question as the rich young ruler. Now, what other thing can I do to ensure that I get to heaven? Perhaps we ought to read Matthew 25, and you can read it in your own time. What's in Matthew 25? It's about the separation of the sheep and the goats. And on what basis were they separated?
How they treated their fellow man.
How they treated their fellow man. It had nothing to do with whether they could do 28 fundamental Bible studies at all. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we shouldn't focus on our relationship with God to the point where we want to go to heaven. That's not the issue for me, is that in a lot of respects getting to heaven is a byproduct of being God's witness. It's not the prime focus of our lives. It's a very, very attractive byproduct. Right? Because Jesus himself said there'll be people who say, "Lord, Lord," and he said, "I didn't know you. Didn't know you." You know, I could introduce another thought, which was Philip saying to Jesus when he said, "I'm going to the Father," and he said, "Show us the Father." And I can almost hear Jesus sighing now, because he said to them, "Have I not been with you all this time?" And you're saying, "Show us the Father." Well, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. You know, and for us as Christians, that is our answer too. If you want to know what God's like, you should be able to see it in how I behave, how I am, what I'm doing, what I'm saying, how I'm functioning. Is that a fair comment? It is a fair comment, isn't it? So, seeking the lost. How many people on the planet today?
8 billion.
Yeah, well, it feels a bit daunting when we're told that, you know, the gospel will go to every nation, kindred, tongue and people, and we think I'm just ordinary Joe Bloggs in the community, what can I do? I want to suggest to you that you only need to do the one thing that the Holy Spirit drives you to do on whatever occasion it is. Be part of the sum of the whole. Now, Ellen White says that a lot of people go through their spiritual lives thinking that they'd really like to do some great things, and she says, just do the things around you. A lot of religion in a loaf of bread, she said. Yeah? So, seeking the lost is that, really, I heard you pray before about the needs. And I'm talking about the observed needs and not maybe the express needs, but express needs come about the needs of the people in the city of Brisbane. You know, my Sabbath school class at home, we pray for our city every week. We pray for the government in Canberra every week because we're conscious that we would like God to be controlling in those places. And if you don't ask, I think you don't get. And I think too, in praying those things, it changes your perspective on how you deal with the people in those places. You know, because you express a confidence that God can make a change and you're being a part of it. True? All right. What are you going to take away today? Now look, it's really important for us to learn the lesson of history. We don't want to end up like Israel. Now, the baton of taking the gospel to the world was taken away from them because they'd so dismally failed. Do we want to be in that group at the end of time that Jesus said, in spite of all of your prayers and all of your statements and whatever, I didn't know you because you didn't deal with the people I wanted to deal with? No. A word I hear a lot these days is intentional. What are we going to do intentionally about spreading the gospel? If you remember nothing else today, I'd like you to consider that question. What can I do intentionally to spread the gospel? Let's sing.